Hello and welcome back to our last mini lecture for chapter 1. This lesson is going to cover just the anatomical terms, body directions, body cavities, more of the we call language of anatomy, the parts and pieces part, right? So you can think of the homeostasis discussion we had would be like the physiology, the functioning part of material from chapter 1, and the anatomical terms and like body systems and organization. Those are the anatomy, all the parts and pieces, right? So this section, this is finishing up chapter 1. So the first thing is a discussion on what we call superficial anatomy. So superficial anatomy is external. Now we're not cutting inside yet, we're not getting inside, but we have to start becoming familiar with the anatomical terms. We just can't call them shoulder and elbow and knee and thigh anymore. We got to have some more anatomically specific terms. So this is your very foundation of getting some of this information down, because we'll see that this is built upon regularly in like your skeletal system, your muscular system, your nervous system, your cardiovascular system. We use a lot of these terms over and over again. So the better you are at understanding and recognizing and being able to spell all of these things, the easier things will be later on. So you won't have to relearn them every time you're learning a new bone or muscle or blood vessel or nerve. So I'm not going to go through all of these. The bolded term from your text, this is the anatomical term. This is the key one that we're looking for. So for example, axillary or armpit, we can't call it armpit anymore. Armpit is the common language. We are going to now call our armpit the axilla or axillary. We can't call this elbow pit the elbow pit anymore. It is called the antecubital. This is the olecranon. This is brachial. This is antebrachial, carpal, manus, phalanges. So it's pure memorization. So do what you have to do, print off pictures, find some Google images, just label, practice over and over and over again. That's the one thing about the anatomy part of anatomy and physiology. Repetition is going to be your friend. So do it over and over and over again until you can label a picture fully without looking, without making mistakes. That should be your ultimate goal every time you're learning new anatomy. So one way that I like to recommend students doing, because it's kind of fun, you can get your loved ones involved with it, pets even, is make little, I don't have any Post-it notes at home, so I just cut little pieces of paper and put tape on the back, so it's very low key if you don't have Post-its, but make a label for each of these terms between both your textbook and your lab manual, because there's a few that aren't on each, so between the two resources. So just label yourself, or label your kiddo, or your spouse, or your loved one, or your cat, or dog, or stuffed animal, or whatever, or yourself, right? You have a body, you're all these things. So for example, buccal, or I've heard it say buccal. I like buccal, because it makes me think of bugle, which you'd have to squeeze your buccinator, which is the muscles here. Buccal is your cheek. So then there you go. So now you'll label yourself as buccal. Let's see, what else do I have? What is this one? Mental. It's not that I'm mental. It's a slang word. Mental is your chin, or mentis. Sometimes it's called mentis. Let's see, what's this one? Acromial. Sometimes you might see it as acromion. It's more of a noun. Acromial is more of an adjective. If you look on the diagram, acromial, this is the point of your shoulder. Like right here, you can feel the point. So there's my acromion. What's that? Otic. I'll put it over here. That's your ear, right? So imagine the fun that you would have with your family as everybody's staying inside, safe from the pandemic and smoke. I don't know if we're still gonna have smoke. I'm recording this 2 weeks before term starts, when all the fires kind of broke out. So while you're home, label each other, label yourself, learn these terms. Learn them so well that you will eventually be able to label a whole blank picture without looking, without making mistakes, and spelling everything correctly. So for spelling in lab, like when we're doing our lab quizzes and lab practicum, you have to spell the words correctly. We have a rule between all the E&P teachers. You can miss 2 letters. So you can have 2 letters either missing or out of place before we mark it wrong. So most of the time people can get within the 2-letter limit for that. So make sure not only are you verbally and orally practicing these things, but don't forget to write them down as you're studying, because writing things down will help you remember them. It will help also with your visual of the correct spelling. So if you do spell it wrong, you're like, hey, that doesn't look right. And then you'll maybe take a second to rethink how to properly spell things. Okay, so that's what we call the superficial anatomy. The next thing is we're looking at abdominopelvic regions and quadrants. So this is just from, if I can stand up, just from the diaphragm down. It does not include the chest, the lungs, and the heart. So from diaphragm down, these are abdominopelvic quadrants, and regions are like a tic-tac-toe board. So for the quadrants, like a big plus sign centered on your belly button, you can see we have, and these names are really easy. So right upper, left upper, right lower, left lower. That's all it is. So the reason why we have these regions and quadrants is you could have a patient coming in complaining of pain in their right lower quadrant, and you're like, okay, so what kinds of things are found in the right lower quadrant? So here, maybe I'll do purple so you can kind of see it a little bit. Right, so right lower quadrant, it looks like we've got some intestines, we got a little bit maybe of the urinary bladder, but look at this, this guy right here can sometimes cause a lot of people some problems. So if you have a patient coming and complaining of pain in their right lower quadrant, that's a good clue that maybe they could have appendicitis, or maybe they could have a blocked bowel, or maybe they could have, a urinary tract infection. Or what if they had pain or complaining of things in their left upper quadrant? Maybe it's a spleen. Maybe it's the stomach. So kind of knowing, it's almost like mapping out your abdominal pelvic cavity with the organs that are underlying, so you can be a little bit more focused on how you can provide care. So those are our quadrants. The regions are like a tic-tac-toe board with the umbilical region centered right over your belly button. So in the uppermost row, again, you can't see, maybe I can point my, not really. So in the upper row, you have what are called the left and right hypochondriac regions, which are right under your ribs. Chondra means cartilage, hypo means below. So right below your ribs on the left and right, and epigastric is kind of right under your sternum. Then the middle row, we have left and right lumbar with your belly button in the middle. And then on the bottom row, we have left and right inguinal, and then hypogastric. So again, these are the red boxes over here, the tic-tac-toe. So I'll maybe do green. So you can say, so the appendix would either be in the right lower quadrant if you were reporting via quadrants, or it could be either in the hypogastric or the right inguinal, kind of right on the boundary there, depending on where that person's appendix is. The spleen would probably be more in the left hypochondriac region. And now one thing I want to point out, if you're looking at these things with all of the pictures of how we're seeing it, you're like, okay, so I see left upper, but it's on the right side of the picture. So what's the deal? When you're looking at anatomical people, you always see them what's called anatomical position. So anatomical position is they're standing, arms at their sides, and you always reference things from the perspective of the patient, from the purpose, from the person. So left upper is this guy's left side. That's his left side. So that is his left upper, even though when we look at it in a picture, it's on the right side of our perspective. So anatomical language, anatomical position is always from the perspective of the patient, the person being observed, not the observer, if that makes sense. All right, so those are your quadrants and regions. So the takeaway for this one is you should be able to know the names of your quadrants, which is just, left, right, upper, and lower, and your regions, all of these terms here. So hypochondriac, lumbar, inguinal, epigastric, umbilical, hypogastric, and then right and left. And then you should also have a good understanding of what organs they overlay underneath those quadrants and regions. So say, which of the following organs can be found in the right hypochondriac region? So that would probably be liver, mostly. All right, the next slide is talking about directional terms. So once you are starting to get familiar with the actual terminology, right? So like all of your little names or your regions, how could you describe things in relationship to other things? So these are our directional terms. So you can use these diagrams, and I'll be talking about this in lab as well. Proximal, distal, medial, lateral, superior, inferior, anterior towards the front, anterior or ventral, posterior or dorsal is towards the back, cranial or cephalic is towards the head, caudal is towards the tail, superficial is on the outside, deep, I'm not going to show you deep because I have to rip open my skin, deep would be towards the middle. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on these. This is more kind of your application practice, and we'll have some lab time to do this as well. So make sure you're comfortable being able to use these directional terms to describe where things are in relationship to other things. Okay. Next, we have body planes and sections. So once we do start cutting into the body and seeing things inside, we need to know from what perspective we are looking at them. So frontal plane is separating your front half from your back half. So that's a little purple slice here. Frontal is like this. Right? Sagittal or mid-sagittal is right on the midline, but you could have parasagittal. Kind of sagittal is meaning you're separating left and right sides. So that's the blue plane there. And then transverse is separating top from bottom or superior from inferior. Okay. So, sorry, I'm watching my cat out the window. She's chasing bugs. So frontal is this way, sagittal is this way, transverse is this way. All right, so just be comfortable being able to recognize and identify the planes of which you are seeing things be presented in. All right. Alrighty, so lastly we have body cavities. So body cavities, again, now we're inside. So we had our superficial anatomy, we had directional terms, we had quadrants and regions. So now we're going to take a look at our body cavity. So we have two major body cavities. We have dorsal and ventral. Dorsal is broken up into two subcategories with cranial, which is where your brain is, and vertebral or spinal, which is where your spinal cord is. They are continuous with each other. They're not separated by anything. As you can see, it's a continuous continuity from the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. Called dorsal because dorsal we just learned was towards the back. So brain and spinal cavities are your dorsal body cavities. Then we have our ventral body cavity. It's divided into two larger groupings called the thoracic and abdominopelvic. And those are ventral because ventral means towards the front. But then each one of those are going to have their breakdown as well. So if we look over here, the thoracic cavity has mediastinum, plural, and pericardial. So within the thoracic cavity, you have mediastinum, which is just kind of a space right above your heart, pleural, which is where your lungs are located, and pericardial, where your heart is located. And the diaphragm is the divider between your thoracic and abdominopelvic. And then the abdominopelvic, which is kind of cut off by my head here, is made up of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. There's no physical separator here. It's just more of a location thing. So there's not like a membrane or a muscle that separates those. But abdominal pelvic, think of these are all your guts and stuff for like digestion. And pelvic cavity is more urinary bladder and reproductive organs. So organ-wise, you can kind of come up with a dividing line there. All right, so that wraps up our last mini lecture on chapter 1. So this was all anatomical languages and terms and definitions and identifying things. So all of chapter 1, we had kind of the introduction and organization and body systems. Then we talked about homeostasis, the mechanisms, positive feedback, negative feedback. And then this last one was just introducing all the terms, the superficial anatomy, directional terms, planes, regions and quadrants, and body cavities. Seems like I'm missing something. Anyways, lots of memorization, lots of vocabulary. Make sure you're doing this every day. Keep at labeling pictures, flashcards if you want to, but make sure you're writing things out as well as verbal and oral review. Send me any questions. I am more than happy to help. I'm glad that I'll be able to see you in person to address some of these issues, but I will also be doing Zoom office hours. All of those hours and stuff will be posted in your syllabus and in that welcome video. So make sure you watch that if you haven't done so yet, and I will see you next time for chapter 4. Bye.